Okay, so in the last video, the part 1 for chapter 6, we ended talking about the logistic curve. Again, really quick, in a logistic curve situation, your population is not going to plateau. Your population is not going to maintain itself from a day-to-day situation. That's just not going to happen. So what happens even with seasonal changes, because in the spring there's more food and water and stuff like that with snow melt and all, and more sunlight, your population is going to have an overshoot. It's going to get a little higher than your carrying capacity. And then when resources aren't so good, it's going to have a die-off. And it's going to do this fluctuation quite frequently around that carrying capacity. But you still see an established carrying capacity. So just because we show it as a flat portion, it's not really flat. Okay, but that's just something to know. Environmental resistance is that little area of the logistic curve where it starts to go away from exponential. And I'll talk about this in class. And that's because some limiting factor, and a limiting factor can be absolutely anything an organism needs to live. It could be food, it could be water, it could be shelter, it could be predation, it could be nutrients, it could be all kinds of things that help to establish that carrying capacity. But it will establish that carrying capacity. Okay. So, growth factors versus decreasing factors, things that are, cause organisms to grow versus population to decrease. These are your biotic potential things versus your environmental resistance. And they're constantly working one after the other. So on your growth sides, things that would make your population grow is favorable light, favorable temperature, favorable chemical environment, nutrients, that kind of thing, pH, whatever it is. High reproductive rate, generalized niche, adequate food supply, sustainable habitat, etc., etc. You can read through these. Those are things that are going to make your population reproduce quickly. Things that are going to basically cause your population to hit a carrying capacity are on the right side. Excuse me. What's kind of interesting, read through these. I'm not going to say them. You can read through them. But in a little bit, we're going to talk about K-selected species and R-selected species. And what do you know? Biotic potential is R-selected, and environmental resistance, the blue side, is K-selected. And we'll talk more about that. And this will start to all kind of jive as to why this. And it even comes into like it being endangered species and stuff. So it'll make sense in a little bit. Okay, so we study populations for a lot of reasons, to basically see what's happening with the animals, for lots of reasons. It's just something interesting to do. A lot of the long-term studies have challenged the idea that populations of large animals are pretty stable over time. In fact, they're not. They oscillate just like every other population. Your prey populations, of course, are going to oscillate. You see that a lot more with them sometimes. But the predator populations also oscillate. One of the good examples of this is of a moose and wolf population on Isle Royale. It saw that the moose population basically collapsed during a very harsh winter, but the wolf numbers peaked. But if you think about it, all the moose died, so all the wolves had a whole lot of food to eat. So they fluctuate. They all fluctuate, and they fluctuate sometimes together and sometimes independent of each other. But populations are not steady. Okay, so there's the Isle Royale, and you can see the moose population in green really died off once winter, but the wolf population actually did fine. Oh, hello, there was a lot of dead mooses around to eat. A boom or bust cycle, again, the overshoot and then the die off, and then overshoot and die off, kind of around a carrying capacity. We see this a lot with organisms, And it just is kind of a weird pattern. It's not necessarily having anything to do with the time of year or seasonality. We just kind of see it with a lot of organisms, and might be because we get high density, and so then we get density dependent factors like disease or something that takes them down to a lower population, and then they rebound. So there's lots of things that can cause this, but it's kind of a boom or bust cycle. So animals that usually have a boom or bust life cycle usually have a short lifespan. They produce many, many offspring. They're usually smaller organisms. They don't maintain a population near carrying capacity. And they're controlled by density independent factors. So all the things. And they're also usually are strategist or are selected species. We'll talk about those a little bit later, and this will kind of all fall into place, I hope. Think of love bugs. They show up in October October-ish, and then they die out quickly. Although I don't remember a lot of love bugs this October. Maybe because it was too warm. And then in May, we get a ton of them in May, and then they die out. It's kind of weird that we didn't have too many this October. We might have to discuss that in class, huh? That could have been a seasonal thing, or change in our weather pattern that caused that. Okay, so boom bust. Lynx versus hare is another very interesting example, very classic example of kind of a boom bust cycle. The hare and the lynx kind of go together. Hare population goes up, followed by the lynx population. All the predators bring the hare population down, and then so on. Although now we always thought this was kind of a predator-prey oscillation, and now there's a lot of theories as to why actually these oscillations occur, because some of the oscillations with the hare actually even occurs when the lynx is not present. So there's some hypotheses as to why this occurs. What's kind of interesting is I think hypothesis 3 is the one that actually seems to jive, although it seems like a really weird thing. But those are some of the hypotheses you can read there just for your information. Okay, so population curves. So, we have the exponential. Yeah, that's all kind of all interesting. You read through it, but yeah. Okay, here we go. Reproductive strategies. This is what I wanted to get to. Reproductive strategies. There's two. The reproductive strategy is basically a range. There is a spectrum. K is one end, R is the other. So most animals lie somewhere in between, having few of the K selected strategies and some of the R, or somewhere in between. But these are the two extremes. The K standing for carrying capacity, K selected species are usually large animals, lots of your birds. They are much more likely, or almost always likely, to have a logistic growth curve. So they have that S curve. They're much more dependent on density dependent factors, causing mortality than density independent factors. They're much more likely to survive a drought or flood or that kind of thing. So your R-selected species are the other end of your spectrum. They're usually smaller organisms, rodents, that kind of thing, much more likely to have mortality caused by density independent factors. They often do the overshoot and die off. They're much more likely to have kind of a boom-bust cycle or a J curve to some extent. So these are the two extremes. Most organisms fall in the middle. This is what you need to know, and you need to be able to recall this and do this. K-selected species, they have a very long lifespan. They live 80, 100, 150 years. They live a long time. Hundreds of years, potentially, with trees. The time to reproductive maturity, the age at which they have their first offspring, is long. They're not going to reproduce till they're 20, 30, 50, 80 years old kind of thing. the number of offsprings or the number of reproductive events they have, how many times they have babies, is very few. And that's usually because they start very late in life, and then they only have very few offspring, and they have them far apart, 3 to 5 years apart kind of thing. They don't necessarily reproduce annually or monthly. They don't reproduce very quickly. The number of offsprings they produce are usually very few. They have a few babies, but they take care of their babies, so they have parental care. The size of their offspring are usually bigger. This is much more likely to be an organism that gives birth kind of thing rather than just laying eggs. Population growth rate, because of these things, if you reproduce late in life, if you only have a couple babies, if you only have a few reproductive events in your life, you don't you produce 10 kids in your lifetime, not 1,000. That's going to slow your population growth rate. You're going to have a very, very slow population growth rate, which means you are less likely, or you're going to recover from any kind of population decreases, large population decreases, very slowly. Example, blue whale. Very large animal, lives a long time, reproduces, start late in life, only one calf at a time, one calf every 3 years. And we hunted them to very low numbers, and because of all these factors, reproducing late in life, one large calf every 3 years, that kind of thing, you just can't reproduce quick enough to get your numbers back up. So their numbers have been very, very, very slow to increase and recover because of these factors. Much more likely to have density-dependent factors affect you, much more likely to have a stable population around a carrying capacity. These are K-selected species. They're also known as K-strategist or K-whatever. If you see K, capital K, and then something, K-species, K-selected, K-strategist, K-whatever, that's what they're talking about, these organisms. These are the organisms also that are much more likely to become endangered because of that low reproductive rate. Okay? Okay. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the R-selected species. They usually have a very short lifespan, very short time to reproduce until their reproductive age, sometimes a matter of days or months, and they're reproductive. Lots and lots of reproductive events. They can reproduce and have babies every 30 days kind of thing. They are having babies like crazy. Lots and lots of offspring, lots of eggs. They're laying tons of eggs or having huge batches, and no parental care. They abandon them. There's a bunch of eggs sitting over there, and I'm off somewhere else. No parental care. Abandon the eggs. Lay them and I'm out of here. They have a very fast population growth rate because of this. If you're laying, 1,000 eggs every 30 days, even if a lot of them die, you're still reproducing very fast. Much more like to have density independent factors affect their population. And then their population size will highly fluctuate. It will be kind of a boom-bust cycle kind of thing. Again, these are two extremes. Most animals are somewhere in the middle. Think about sea turtles. They're very K in certain ways. They live 150 years. They don't reproduce until they're 30 for the first time. They only reproduce about every other year or every third year. But when they do reproduce, they lay hundreds of eggs, 300 eggs in a year, and they abandon them. So most animals are a combination of K and R. We're pretty darn K all the time. Bears are pretty darn K all the time. Whales are pretty darn K all the time. There are animals that are truly K, and there are animals that are truly R, but a lot of organisms are in between. They have a little of both. Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. We'll talk about survivorship curves in a minute.